Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Happy palette week. Yes, that is right. You heard correct. Today we are starting a palette week, so every single day from today until 7 days from now, I will be posting some sort of palette themed content. I love to do palette weeks quarterly on my channel, and today we are kicking it off with a good old-fashioned eyeshadow palette chopping block. I originally was going to film a video about palettes I would grab if my house was burning down. I filmed this video quite some time ago and was going to do an updated version. And as I was grabbing these palettes, I was like looking through each cubby of my eyeshadow palettes, and I was like, do I want to keep this palette? Like, what are my thoughts on it? And about every 6 months or so, I do like to do an updated eyeshadow palette collection and declutter. So I do plan to do a declutter at the end of June. And I have, I think 13, maybe 17 palettes. I can't remember. I just counted and now I forgot. But I have some palettes in front of me that I am considering as I look through my entire eyeshadow palette collection. These are palettes that I'm definitely considering decluttering when the time comes, but I feel like I'm not certain of my choice, so I want to put them in this chopping block sort of video. And I also figured during my next pan and every palette update, I will add a 5th palette and have a separate chopping block wheel where I try and include one of these palettes in my no pan left behind. I want to spend the next 3 months or so before my declutter really looking at these palettes, as well as looking at my palette collection and figuring out if I can dupe shades that I like in a palette with other palettes that maybe I prefer the formula more or want to keep in my collection, and try and just cut down my palette collection by just the littlest amount even, because I do love eyeshadow palettes. I love buying new eyeshadow palettes. I love trying new palettes, new palette formulas, whatever it might be. But sometimes I get decluttered by my own palette. Sometimes I get overwhelmed by my own palette collection. So I don't want to feel that way. And these are the palettes that are definitely the ones on my mind most. Some of them may even surprise you, but these are definitely on my mind the most for potential declutters down the road. So that being said, if you guys are interested in seeing what palettes I'm thinking about potentially decluttering, if you want to give your feedback, I would love your guys' feedback in the comments below. I love reading your suggestions for other palettes I might be able to dupe with this, or just you talking me in or out of things. So leave me your comments down below. But if you're interested, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I'd love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Okay, you guys, these are in no particular order at all. I literally, as I said, just went cubby by cubby. I have my eyeshadow palettes in like a 6 cubby organizer. I just went cubby by cubby, and any palette that I was like not 100% certain I was gonna keep, I pulled out and I'll be sharing it with you today. So maybe we can start with these, like the smallest palettes that I am considering decluttering. And first I have this one from REM Beauty. This is the Go-Go Boots palette, and I purchased this last summer-ish, I believe. This is what this one looks like. I don't know why I've had like this huge fascination around the REM brand, because I am not like an Ariana Grande fan. I never watched, what was the show that she was in? I never watched that show. I never listened to her music. I feel like, I'm not gonna say what I'm gonna say because I feel like so many people are ride or die for Ariana Grande, but I've just never been like I could care less. But for some reason, I'm so drawn to the REM brand and have continued to want to try things. And I was like, oh, perfect. Well, obviously it makes sense for me to try an eyeshadow palette because I love trying eyeshadow palettes. So I picked up the Go-Go Boots palette because for some reason I felt like if I had these pops of color, it was going to be perfect for my collection. And while I don't think this is a bad palette, this is just, I mean, there's 5 shimmers and 1 matte in this palette, and this is the matte. Like, this is just not a palette I'm gonna reach for on an everyday basis. I've created like 3 looks with this and not even thought about it since. So I feel like that really should be my answer right there. Like, I probably can declutter this one, but nevertheless, I'm including it in this chopping block. Next, I have this one from Tilbury. This is the Exaggerize Quad, and I like this. I think it's fine, but I do feel like it's just something that takes up space in my collection, and if I were to use this, there are other palettes I would rather use over this. I feel like this serves a purpose if I like am in a rush and need something just super quick and easy for work, or if I were to be traveling for work, this would serve a purpose for that. But aside from that, this quad just like doesn't get me excited. I purchased this because I just had to know what the Charlotte Tilbury eyeshadow formula was about, and I don't understand why people pay $54 or over $50 for these. I don't understand it. But because I spent so much money on it, you can understand why I'm struggling to get myself to declutter. I also have this one from M Cosmetics, and I struggled to declutter this because one, it is from M Cosmetics, an indie brand, and I think this is really cute. I like this palette, but I wish I had waited just a little bit longer to purchase an eyeshadow palette from M Cosmetics, because they have these like neutral little hexagons, or what, 1 2 3 4 5 6, yeah, little hexagons now from M Cosmetics, that I think the color story just would have worked better for me. However, I do still enjoy this. I just never reach for it. This is one of those that like, I like the formula, I just literally never reach for this. So I'm like, why am I keeping this around? So this is one that I definitely do want to pull out, try and do no pan left behind on this one, and see what my feelings really are on this before I make that decision. I feel like this one would be a little bit more of a hard decision than say like the REM palette, but that one is still on my mind as a possibly declutter. Next, I have this one from Oma Beauty. This is the Coming to America palette. This is a cute little 9-pan colorful palette, but I just never reach for this. I purchased this because it reminded me of the Sugar Pill Fun Size palette, which I love, but I barely reach for that palette because it's an all matte colorful palette, and so why I thought that I would reach for this one, I don't know. I know I did want to try the Oma Beauty formula, their eyeshadow formula, which is one of the reasons that I purchased this, but I like literally never reach for this. So this is one that before I declutter, ooh, this would have been a fun hot pink to use on Valentine's Day. This is one that before I declutter or make the decision to declutter, I definitely need to use this to like actually have a solid opinion on how I feel about the formula, and maybe I'll end up keeping it, who knows. Okay, this might surprise you, but I have 2 palettes I'm considering decluttering from Odin's Eye. Odin's Eye makes they have my favorite eyeshadow formula currently, but there are 2 palettes that I'm like, I don't know if I need these in my collection. The first one is the Saga Freya palette. This is Chapter 1, Tears of Freya. And this is what this palette looks like. It's a very warm toned palette with like a pop of this, 2 pops of cool tones. And the shade Tears is definitely more of like an ethereal lid topper shade as opposed to this really punchy shade that I personally thought it was going to be. So that right there was a bit of a disappointment. I like this palette. It's just like nothing special in my opinion. It's thicker. Like I feel like the packaging is bulkier than it needs to be, and for the shades in here, like it's not the most inspiring color story, so that's why I struggled to decide whether or not I should keep it around. Also not like Odin's Eye has come a ways from this in terms of their eyeshadow formula. Like this definitely isn't like the tippity top notch Odin's Eye formula, so that's where I'm at with that. And then also the Verdandi, the 6-pan palette, is just not a color story that I really ever am reaching for. I don't do red or orange eyeshadow really ever, and the reason I've kept this around is for the like shimmer shades in the middle, the 2 shimmer shades, but I have so many single shadows from indie brands. I have other Odin's Eye palettes, I have Adept Cosmetics palettes, I have so many other options for shades similar to this that I'm like, why am I keeping this? I really probably don't need to. So this is another one that as I chat through it, I'm like, I feel like I'm talking myself out of it, like I don't need it, but that's where I sit with that. Next, this one from Nabla, the Cutie palette. This is one that I considered decluttering last declutter when I decluttered a couple other Nabla Cutie palettes. I feel like I really only keep this one around for these 3 shades right here, and really like Alaska and Dissolution are my favorite. I want to do a look with the shade Nothing Personal before I officially make the decision on whether or not I want to declutter this. But my other thought is that I could potentially depot the shades that I want out of this palette and then get rid of the rest. So I don't know, I don't get inspired when I look into this little 6-pan palette. So, and then also from Nabla, and you guys know I love Nabla, so you're probably like, what's going on? But the Nabla Dreamy palette. I love the Dreamy 2, and I lost my Dreamy 2 palette. I have literally no idea where it went, but I'm just never inspired to reach for the Nabla Dreamy palette. I talked about potentially decluttering this in my last eyeshadow palette declutter as well, and I feel like I've barely reached for it at all since then. So this is one I want to do a no pan left behind, see how my thoughts really are, see if when I start to truly create looks out of this palette where I'm only reaching into this palette, do I love it or can I get rid of it? I'm honestly not sure how I feel, but it's definitely one that I am considering decluttering. Kind of in that same like mauve-y rosy color story, we'll move along to this. This is my Artist Couture Supreme Mauves palette. And I feel like I will definitely struggle to declutter this palette if I do decide to declutter this palette, because I love the Artist Couture brand, the formula, the eyeshadow palettes, the sleek packaging. The Supreme Nudes palette is one of my favorite palettes in my collection. I also love the Supreme Bronze palette. So I was super excited for Supreme Mauves to come out, and this just is not as good, like by a long shot, as the other two palettes. I find that the shimmers in here are rather chunky or just don't have a punch on the eye at all, and I don't feel like the mattes blend as nicely as his formula normally blends. Like I feel like the shades are just kind of like chalky and dry and they muddy together, and it's just not a good situation. Looking into this, the color story is absolutely beautiful, but the actual execution on the eyes has not been what I am expecting or looking for from the Artist Couture formula. So considering, I think I would struggle to get rid of that one, but I'm considering it. And then also from Vieve Cosmetics, I have the Muse palette, which is a really beautiful color story. This is just a large palette, and I don't find myself wanting to reach for this all that often. So I'm wondering if I can dupe the color story with other palettes in my collection. It's a fine eyeshadow formula, definitely not my favorite formula by any means. I don't think it's bad, it's just I don't get inspired and I don't reach for this palette that often, so it leaves me questioning why I have it in my collection, and also leads me to believe that this is something that I could potentially see myself decluttering and not being upset about. So that is a consideration. Next, some of these I like surprised myself when I pulled them out, but I have the Urban Decay Naked Wild West palette. I feel like my Cowboy Rick shade is like came broken, and oh my gosh, like this is just like a messy disaster, and now it's all over my finger. Oh goodness. The crumbled formula annoys me, or the crumbled shade annoys me, and I just don't know if this color story is like special enough to keep in my collection. Like I never wake up in the morning and I'm like, I'm super excited to reach for the Naked Wild West palette today. I think it's a good palette, it's a good formula. I just don't know that I need this in my collection anymore. So that's where I'm at with this. Next up, I have this one. And if I do get rid of this, I definitely will depot this center shade because I love this center shade. I also maybe would depot and keep this like daffodil yellow shade. I just have never been that impressed with the Juvia's Place eyeshadow formula, and I feel the same way about this palette. I don't feel like the shades blend nicely together. I don't feel like I just never am like so happy with the way that my shadow turns out or my eyeshadow look, but I love this center shade right here, so I just feel like I would have to keep this shade. It's this really beautiful, very intense like golden shade that I just absolutely love. So I'm not sure about this one. Let me know what you're thinking in the comments below. Sassy Siennas. I love this palette, but never use it. So like, if I'm not gonna use it, why am I keeping it around? So mostly this is in the chopping block just to like encourage me to use it, see if I still love it like I used to. I love this color story for the summertime. I also have my Sigma Quarter Rosa. Do I need this? I'm not sure, but it's like driving me crazy that it sits in my collection. I like the formula, like the color story, and I never use it. So I either need to use it or lose it. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think we're doing it. But I opened this palette up because I was thinking about including this in if my house was on fire, is this a palette that I would grab? Because this is like a favorite palette of mine. And as I looked inside, I was like, I don't think it is what I would grab if my house was on fire, because while I love this, I think I would be okay without it. I think, but I'm not sure. This palette has just so many good memories tied to it, and therefore I don't think I would actually declutter it, but I kind of wanted to pull it into this chopping block to encourage me to like no pan left behind this palette, just because I feel like I haven't actually played around with some of the color and creating colorful looks out of this palette. I've done a ton with the neutral shades in this palette. I have I have 3 pans in this palette. So clearly this palette has been loved throughout its lifetime, but I need to decide whether or not this is something that I don't think this one will actually get decluttered, but I just wanted to chat about it, you know? The Nomad, Iceland, Fire and Ice, Land, Isles, Ice, Iceland, Fire and Ice. That's what it is. I was right the first time. Wasn't that impressed with this palette. I do want to use this, see if, you know, maybe I was wrong. But I do eventually want to purchase another Nomad Cosmetics palette. I feel like I've kept this around because it's my only Nomad palette in my collection, but also like if I'm not using it, it's still like, why am I keeping it around? I can purchase a Nomad palette at any time if I want. But I do want to try and get a little bit more use out of this palette before I make that decision, just because it's been a little bit since I've used it. So maybe I can manipulate the shades to work better for me. Maybe I have a different eyeshadow primer that's going to be better. But I really just didn't feel like the shades lasted on my eyes. And I also didn't feel like the shimmer shades were like that punchy or intense. But I can't remember who said this, but they said the shimmer shades from Nomad are best applied with your finger. So I want to try it that way and see if I like it better before I declutter. And then finally I have 2 ColourPop palettes. This one is the One and Done palette from last year. I almost decluttered this last year, and then I decided to keep it because I wasn't sure. And I just don't feel like I probably don't need this palette. The blue brown shade was a huge letdown, as it always is in ColourPop eyeshadow palettes. They just clearly can't seem to make a good blue brown shade in my opinion. But I am interested in the hot pink shade. Like, do I really like that? And are there any shades within this palette that I need to depot and keep, which I oftentimes do. Like if I'm decluttering a ColourPop palette, but there's a couple of shades that I really enjoy, I'll just depot those shades and keep those and declutter the rest of the palette. So I do anticipate I will end up getting rid of this palette. Like I don't see myself keeping this. It's just a matter of deciding if there's any shades within this palette that will be staying with me. The palette as a whole, I don't think so. I don't believe. And then finally, the Getting Fresh palette, which I also purchased last year. I was so excited about this, and I was just so let down in the green shades, which is the reason I purchased this palette. Clearly I love green eyeshadow, and I was super excited specifically for the shade The Point as well as Cereal and On the Outs. I do still need to like dabble. I still need to dabble in quite a bit of this palette. I really do. But I was just so bummed by a couple of those shades, and this is another situation where I kind of want to try and get use out of every shade and make a decision. Like, would I be keeping over half of these shades if I kept this palette, because then it probably makes sense to keep this palette? Or are there only a couple of shades that I really enjoy that I can then depot and put into a different Z palette and get rid of the rest of the palette? I'm not sure, which is why I'm including this palette in this chopping block. After that, those are all of the palettes that are on my current chopping block. Things may change. Maybe I'll fall in love with some of these palettes. Maybe there's other palettes that I did not pull out for today's chopping block that I will decide I just don't love anymore. But I would love your feedback in the comments below. What do you think I should keep? What do you think I'm ready to let go of? Let me know what your thoughts are down below. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch today's video, for supporting my channel, supporting Palette Week. As always, leave any palette themed content you'd be interested in catching down below. I love your guys' palette themed content ideas, and clearly love making eyeshadow palette content. So let me know down below. Other than that, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you guys in tomorrow's video. Bye.